Alright, we're gonna react to this video 10 precise moments that forever changed MMA rules. Ready?
One of the biggest misconceptions about MMA is that it has very few rules. Depending on how your hands are placed on the ground, you can't use certain maneuvers, you can't elbow at particular angles. Apparently, if you have a boob job, that creates a bit of an issue with getting past health regulations. I don't know. And the more and more you dive into it, the more mindless minutia there is in the rule set. And so this misconception that there are so few rules stems back to the old days more than it does anything else. Ball punches, fish hooking, hair pulling, punches to the back of the head, knees on the ground, etc. used to all be legal, which for obvious reasons all became illegal. But there are also a lot of crazy rules that basically had to come about because somebody actually tried to do it. So that's what we'll get into today. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the top 10 houses sold by Ally Quinta.
Finally.
Number 10, the Mac Mansion. I don't know what just happened there. My bad. These are 10 precise fight moments that forever changed MMA rules. Number 10, Vaseline Gate. Prior to almost all fights in any combat sport, you can usually see a cut man applying Vaseline to a fighter's face, which also gets topped up in between rounds. And basically the reason why is Vaseline reduces the chance of skin getting cut and minimizes the friction of incoming shots, because obviously it's not ideal to have a fight stopped just because of a cut. But until UFC 94, a fighter's cornerman was allowed to apply this at the end of each round. And if you've ever felt Vaseline or petroleum jelly more generically, you'll know it's extremely slippery. So when George St. Pierre's corner began illegally rubbing the substance on his shoulders, chest, and back during his welterweight title defense at UFC 94, questions reasonably arose. Now, nobody knows if this was an honest mistake or genuine attempt to cheat since it was such an incredibly small amount, but his opponent that night, BJ Penn, was furious, and even Dana White had a brief octagon side rant. As a result of the hubbub, right then and there, GSP was toweled down at the beginning of the rounds 3 and 4 by members of the commission, so the Vaseline issue was only in play during the second rounds. But this was an extremely glaring flaw ripe for abuse, and with the extremely vocal protest of BJ Penn's camp and Dana's feelings about the entire thing, the UFC instituted a permanent rule along with the athletic commissions that employed independent cutmen to exclusively apply Vaseline moving forward to the fighters. Number 9, no more Speedos. There's not many sports that have a bigger disparity in male to female fans than MMA. Our own channel's metrics reflect that pretty starkly.
We're the fucking females!
That's basically why we have ring girls and not Magic Mike types parading around the cage, unless of course you're an Invicta. But at UFC 133, Dennis Hallman didn't only fight inside the octagon, but he also ended up showing more skin than your favorite ring girl. In his TKO loss to Brian Ebersol, who already made things weird by having an arrow shaved right into his chest, Hallman wore an extremely small pair of blue trunks, claiming to have lost a bet with his teammates.
And that kind of thing, but a bet's a bet, and you gotta stand up for what you bet.
Regardless, Dana White was outraged in the aftermath, saying that he was horrified at what he saw.
I'd call it disgusting. That was disgusting.
And no one would ever fight in the UFC again looking like that.
It will never happen again, I can guarantee you that.
Thank you, Dana. For his next fight, Hallman would go on to pick up a submission win, but his contract was never renewed by the UFC. And although Dana claims this wasn't due to the clothing fiasco, not that many people are released on winning streaks. And to this day, if you type in Dennis Hallman on Google, Speedo and shorts are usually the first suggestions that show up with your results. The legend lives on. Number 8, 12 to 6 elbows. This is perhaps the silliest rule that fans want changed the most.
The only fight John Jones ever lost was the 12 to 6 elbows, but they were pretty nasty, but he would have won the fight, but whatever.
Especially if your name is John Jones. The most common reason why this straight up and straight down elbow is banned is because athletic commissions were afraid based on seeing martial arts demonstrations where they would break like a whole foot of ice or something dumb like that. Boards that were weakened ahead of time, that kind of thing. While true that this is a factor, that's actually only part of the reason. While speaking on the Joe Rogan podcast, Big John McCarthy, who was there when the first official unified rules of mixed martial arts were created, explained that this technique was banned also also due to one single fight. In the year 2000, 6'10" Gan McGee faced a much smaller foe in Brad Gabriel at IFC Battleground 2. Unfortunately, we couldn't find footage of this online. It's probably in somebody's VHS player, or maybe dubbed over. The giant McGee, who would later go on to challenge for the UFC heavyweight title, blasted his opponent with these downward elbows repeatedly, and it was one of the doctors at this event who would assist John McCarthy in creating unified rules. The doctor wanted to ban all elbows at first, but settled on just banning the 12-6 downwards elbow because of John McCarthy. He cited this fight as the major reason why. Number 7, throwing an opponent over the cage. Despite the fact that there weren't many rules in Tank Abbott's day, you already know he's the type of guy who wouldn't follow the rules even in modern MMA, if he felt he could get away with it. And his intentions during his fight with Cal Worsham at Ultimate in 1996 led to an instant rule being created that many fans may not have even thought about. Immediately as the fight started, Abbott, who had a walkout stat that he benched over 600 pounds, rushed forward in his typical brawling manner, but then surprisingly picked up the 230-pound Cal Worsham and literally tried throwing his opponent over the octagon like it's dead or alive and ring outs are an automatic win or something. The worrying thing was Tank Abbott actually came pretty close, with Worsham explaining that only his heel and the padding saved him from the embarrassment. In the end, Tank comfortably got the victory, but obviously the potential for a fighter to fall 6 foot head first onto a metal platform needed to be removed. Big John McCarthy soon after made the ruling within the UFC to disqualify anyone who tried to throw their opponent over the side of the cage, which also led to the realization that fence grabbing should probably also be banned. Number 6, short grabbing. In MMA today, there's minimal excess clothing, and for
It would be cool if they made like a fight league, like, but you had to fight on trampolines, you know, and then you could just jump up in there and kick people and stuff. That'd be like Street Fighter. More, yeah, that'd be cool. But you know that's how like I think UFC was kind of created, is they just took Street Fighter and kind of made it real. I don't know.
good reason. Fighter shorts don't get in the way by constantly getting disheveled or untucked like they did with the old gis and still do in full gi BJJ competitions today. But in the case of Pat Miletich versus Mikey Burnett for the inaugural welterweight title back in 1998, both men's shorts somehow became a pivotal aspect of the fight. Throughout the entire contest, both Miletich and Burnett had a solid grasp of each other's shorts, which resulted in one very dull affair as neither fighter could break away and begin striking very often. Not only did it make for an obviously uneventful inaugural title fight to take place, but also the crowd found the whole ordeal pretty comical. John McCarthy had the unenviable task of having to fix Burnett's shorts and getting dangerously close to his junk in the process, while fans had a great view of Miletich's right butt cheek. What the fuck, man? So, short grabbing became instantly banned and fighters were legally unable to use them for leverage, again for obvious reasons. Pat's shorts were coincidentally the first UFC shorts with the infamous tap out logo on them and were sold on eBay for over $1,500 in 2015. I'm sure they smell really great. Number 5, the introduction of TKOs. In the very first iteration of the UFC, fights were only ended in one of 3 ways: knockout, submission, or by cornermen throwing in the towel. But even these minimal rules weren't abided by at the inaugural UFC event when Gerard Gordeau landed a massive head kick to the sumo fighter Taylor Tuli and sent his tooth soaring into the front row. That's because the original referee understandably recognized the danger and stopped the fight. UFC founder Rorion Gracie was extremely upset because he didn't want stoppages back then at all. Basically, the loser is out completely cold or they somehow quit through themselves or their team. So Rorion asked his friend Big John McCarthy to referee from there on out and follow this rule completely blindly, unlike the first referees did. Enter UFC 2, where Pat Smith delivered some hellacious elbows to Scott Morris from the mount. So due to the rules, McCarthy was totally unable to stop the fight. And it appears that Big John shouting at Morris's corner and Pat Smith hearing that, deciding to get up, or him just deciding that it was done, meant that the brutal onslaught was over. You can only imagine if he just didn't stop. And so after the event in this particular moment, McCarthy Ibushi threatened to Horion that he would quit if not given the power to protect fighters. So starting at UFC 3, the concept of referee stoppages were born. Number 4, groin shots. Inspired by the UFC, the International Vale Tudo Championship, or IVC for short, held their first event in 1997. It was a one-night tournament in which former UFC fighter Gary Big Daddy Goodridge fought lucha libre expert Pedro Octavio in the finals. Eye gouging and biting were illegal, but groin shots were given the green light by the Brazilian organization, to which Goodridge obliged, striking right at his opponent's prized possession, but would even go further than just kneeing Octavio's balls, digging his feet and toes literally into Pedro's trunks to try to escape being on the bottom. When the two were standing, Goodridge got even more uncomfortably intimate with his opponent, getting a handful of his junk that forced Pedro to fall to the ground in discomfort. And yeah, all this led to Goodridge securing the stoppage victory. The IVC thankfully would create a specific rule banning a fighter from reaching into their opponent's trunks for the following event. The most infamous and justified ball smashing occurred at UFC 4 between convicted gang rapist and murderer Joe Sun by Keith Hackney. But this alone wasn't enough to force an immediate rule change, as this took place a whole 3 years later before the promotion would ban it in 1997, which coincidentally was a few months after the IVC banned it, but for totally different reasons, with mounting political pressure being the biggest reason of all. Number 3, lay and pray. After their first fight at UFC 1, both Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock won various tournaments and titles before their rematch. The UFC's first poster boy Gracie won the UFC 2 and 4 tournaments, while Shamrock went and conquered Pancrase, picking up the inaugural title in Japan. So obviously there was a significant amount of hype when the two rematched at UFC 5, with fans hoping to see how Ken could tackle Royce's submission game at the second attempt. But instead of the interesting grappling affair everyone had hoped for, we witnessed a whole load of inactivity, with Shamrock laying tight in Gracie's guard, just avoiding submissions mostly, and barely taking the risk to land much ground and pound of his own. With there being no ruling to stand up the fighters for lack of action back then, Shamrock essentially just laid there defensively and was afraid to risk anything on top of Royce Gracie for 36 whole minutes until the fight was declared a draw, which marked the longest bout in UFC history and the first draw in the promotion ever. In order to combat this, the referees were immediately given the ability to stand up fighters for inactivity for the following event, which definitely was a great addition to the rule set. Unfortunately, this means we've seen many questionable stand-ups since then, but at least it does prevent something like this from happening. On top of this, overtime limits were formally adopted, in part to avoid number 2, the introduction of judges. The old UFC brass definitely hated the idea of having to bring in judges. They hoped that they had addressed the issue of inactivity with ref stand-ups and overtimes, therefore preventing subsequent draws. After all, aside from Ken vs. Royce 2, 68 of the first 69 UFC fights all ended with a finish. Problem solved, right? Well, not entirely, as Ken Shamrock met Oleg Taktarov at UFC 7 with Ken's super fight title on the line, but standing both men up and asking for action didn't lead to a finish. Despite Shamrock being the aggressor, the bout lacked much activity at all, and a stoppage was never close throughout the 33 minutes. King claimed in his autobiography that he didn't want to inflict too much damage on Oleg, who would train with the Lion's Den, but he was also known for training people ruthlessly back then with a coaching style of just beating everyone up. So, sure. He also said having shoes at UFC 1 would have meant he would beat Royce Gracie.
They took away my shoes because they knew that if they could take away my balance, that Royce would have a better chance of beating me. Just my opinion, they cheated.
But nevertheless, without any actual judges in place Octagon side to score the fight, yet another big main event in the UFC ended in a draw and therefore a massive failure. In response, the next event was the first in UFC history to feature judges' scorecards and decisions along with a 15-minute time limit in an effort to push the action further. Ironically though, during the tournament, both semifinals and the final would all go to a decision. Number 1. One Championship's weight cutting. I think most of us can easily agree that weight cutting is probably the most ridiculous aspect of this sport. Nearly all fighters undergo a gruesome dehydration process just in order.
Yeah, it's not. People don't believe it when you tell them that. They think you're an idiot, but it's like, no, they'll lose 20 pounds plus in 24 hours. That's why they do go in the saunas and stuff. The first time I ever seen it was on The Ultimate Fighter, and they get kicked off the show if they didn't make the weight, and so they, like, wear sweatsuits in the saunas because it's all water weight they shed. But sometimes if they ate anything with sugar in it or whatever, then it they wouldn't be able to get rid of that as easy type of stuff, you know, if they didn't follow diet. And so in a lot of the first toughs or whatever, the Ultimate Fighters, like lots of people got kicked off the show because they couldn't make the weight. But it's like a lot of fighters say it's like half the battle, like one part's the fight, but half the battle is just like making that weight cut because and because everybody does it, so at like 145, these people will weigh like walk around in 180, they'll lose like all that weight overnight, to hit the, so you see them all the time on the scales, they're falling over and stuff and dying, and they'll rehydrate. So it's like, if you fought a natural, they call it 145er, it's like that next day you'll pack on that 20 pounds, by it's horrible that they do it. And that's the whole thing with Islam is they think the way he rehydrated was with a syringe or with whatever they call it, IV, and it's illegal because you shouldn't be cutting that much weight in the first place that you need a fucking IV. And even Khabib, like, he's pulled out of so many fights. That's how you know he's not the greatest of all time, because I think he fought at 155. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, 155. But it took everything in the world for him to beat the scale or whatever. Yeah, they call it, you got to beat your opponent and you got to beat the scale. But like he's had so many fights that they had to call off the fights, like at least 6 in the UFC, because he couldn't make the weight. And if he was that good, he would have fought at 170. You know what I mean? He walked around at like 200 pounds. Yeah, but so that's why McGregor wouldn't fight him, because he pulled out so many times. Pulled out. Okay, so okay. Ready?
In order to not be the smaller man with a weight disadvantage a day later at fight night. In December of 2015, 21-year-old Chinese flyweight Yang Jianbing tragically paid the ultimate price for this insanity and died after attempting a particularly difficult weight cut. It's extremely disappointing that it took a death in order for the ruling to change, but one championship made a drastic overhaul to their weight cutting protocols as a direct result, and utilized hydration tests to essentially eradicate weight cuts altogether. But there are tons of questions of this still, as many fighters look noticeably big on fight night. There are examples like Eddie Alvarez, where even though lightweight is at 170 pounds in one instead of 155, his walking around weight has been claimed to be as high as 190 in the past. You shouldn't be able to get past hydration tests if you're that heavy. He's also stated that his opponents are bigger than him in one. DJ has said the same about his opponents. For Angela Lee, it's in the reverse at atom weight, where she looks bigger than her opponents. In the last month or so, they finally started posting video of the weigh-ins, even though folks like Angela Lee are still showing up needing to use a hoop, which is indicative of a weight cut. Of course, it's still possible if she's trying to stay within hydration limits and just needs that last little bit in the article of clothing to shave it off. It just requires a bit of healthy skepticism, because if it works properly, it should definitely be brought to MMA around the world if it can do what it claims. But the death associated with this rule automatically makes it top our list, and certainly is the most important change to make before it happens under the unified rules. I'd like to thank Tom MJ Moore for editing this video. You can follow him on Twitter at TomMJ.
Fuck, they really stretched it out for it should have been like a 5-minute video at the most, like they stretched it out because, and it was okay, but I hate that. But I'm okay. I'm eating my fucking chopstick. But okay. That was okay. It's better watching it with us reacting than just watching the stupid video by itself. So like, comment, and subscribe. Be you do. Peace out.